So our next speaker, Dr. Jonathan Trent, is another polymath who comes to us with this incredible history and an incredible amount of knowledge on so many fields. I have no idea what to expect from how amazing this talk is going to be, because he is the director of NASA's Omega Global Initiative and also a researcher for establishing human settlement on Mars, which is no small task. So without any further ado, would you please welcome to the stage Dr. Jonathan Trent.
Those two talks were fantastic. It's going to be a hard act to follow. Fantastic. So I have to tell you that I had a meeting with Tim the other day, Tim Forsman, who's one of the organizers for this meeting. And I have scheduled, and you look in my presentation, that I was supposed to talk to you about Mars. I decided not to talk to you about Mars. And the reason I decided not to talk to you about Mars is because the situation we're in is actually quite serious. In fact, as you heard from the previous two speakers, there's some very serious things brewing in our future and even in our near future. And my response to this is a bit like if you go to a doctor and they do a lot of really complicated tests, and the doctor comes back and says, oh my, you have cancer. It's a very serious brain tumor of some kind, right? But then if that same doctor, she tells you, and it's not operable, then it's a really serious problem, right? Because it's one thing to be able to say, oh my God, we're in deep trouble. But it's quite another thing to be able to realize that you can't do anything about it. So what I decided to do with my short time that I have with you right now is to tell you about what we have to work with. The point being that I want to talk to you not about Mars, but about Homo sapien. And I want to talk to you about our ancestors, and in particular, I want to examine what we have between our ears that we have to use to cope with what's going to be happening. And let's go back and look at our ancestors. So let's really seriously consider where we are relative to this question of having a brain that's evolved to cope with the circumstances that we're soon going to be confronting. And let's think about the history, the long history of this brain, 200,000 years, where we can see Neanderthal actually cohabited the planet with us, and he probably had a slightly bigger brain than we have. But Homo sapien is actually in this situation. But what you don't see when you see the picture of evolution that goes from hunting and gathering to farming, agriculture, to the Industrial Revolution, to where we are now, sitting at our computers and looking at big data. What you need to realize is that most of our history, in terms of how our brains have been wired and evolved, is focusing on hunting and gathering. That's about 93.9% of all of brain evolution had to do with hunting and gathering. There's only 6% that had to do with agriculture. 0.1% of our brain's adaptation and evolution had to do with dealing somehow with the industrial age. And 0.027% is now 55 years of computing that we've been so regaled with. There's a really interesting guy named John Medina who wrote a book called Brain Rules. And in his book he says, the human brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to survival in the outdoor setting. In particular, in unstable meteorological conditions, and most importantly, in near constant motion. So I'm sure you're now all thinking that you're sitting there completely immobilized in a hermetically contained room with no movements whatsoever, and you're wondering why your brains aren't functioning properly, right? But in reality, what we're dealing with, and Medina points out, our brains adapted to dealing with hunting and gathering are really asking all the time 4 questions. And the first question, shown here, is, can I eat it, or will it eat me? Those are the first 2 questions, really. Is it a threat, Or is it food, right? This is about survival. And food is a really important issue, right? I mean, we understand this because if Michelangelo came to the United States and was to do a David now, David would look like this. Food is a big issue. The first two questions are, how do I survive in terms of a threat? And how do I survive in terms of food resources? So the third question that our brain has evolved to deal with is it a reproductive opportunity? Can I have sex with it, or will it have sex with me? And you can see the look in the eye, and you all know that look in the eye, right? So the fourth question that we've evolved to cope with is probably the most important, at least from our perspective. And it has to do with, do I know this? Is this familiar with me? It has to do with pattern recognition and curiosity. That's crucial in what our brains have evolved to deal with. Is it known? Is it a pattern I recognize? Or is it something totally new? Einstein actually said that science and art tend to coalesce in the aesthetics, plasticity, and form that the brain has to do with. He also said that he believes that it's a miracle that curiosity survives our formal education. But let's think about this, because this brain that we have evolved with, that is focused on threats and focused on food gathering and focused on sex and focused on pattern recognition, we're here. And what we really need to be able to try to cope with is going forward from our newfound perspective. Now, we all understand that we haven't abandoned the other questions, right? Because if you think about what we see on our computers, it has a lot to do with threats, right? In all the news media, we talk about things that are terroristic and such. It has a lot to do with food, right? As we well know from seeing Michelangelo's new David. And it has a lot to do with sex as you think about the porn sites that you can look at if you go to a computer. But most importantly, we have a new world order that's emerging. So let me show you a brief video that you may be familiar with.
This is the story of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past, We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
So our creativity, energy, and basically ingenuity offer hope. But the brain we have to deal with really fits very nicely into Maslow's scheme. We're looking for food, water, resources, shelter. We're worried about our safety, threats. We have a sense of belonging, which in fact is family and friends and related very closely to this concept of sex that we talked about earlier, reproductive opportunities. And then there's this question of self-esteem, the question of are we respected by others, which probably has a lot to do with this notion that we're talking about with pattern recognition and the ability to see things and be curious and understand how they all fit together. And finally, in Maslow's pyramid, we also have the individual, the recognition of the individual beyond just the social context. But remember, the interesting feature of Maslow's pyramid of needs is that you can't have self-actualization without self-esteem, and you can't have that without having a concept of belonging, and you can't have that until we have safety sort of under control, and you can't have that until you've met your physiological needs, that, as Bob just pointed out to you, all of these things are closely interrelated. So if you look down at the very foundation of Maslow's pyramid, it is really supported by the notion of energy, food, and water, which Larry talked about in the first presentation we saw, and how this energy, food, water nexus actually works, where energy is required to produce food, and water is required to produce food, and food is required to get energy, and water is required to get energy from the environment. And this nexus is very interrelated, as Bob actually pointed out to us very clearly. And these are all influenced by population growth at 7.3 billion. We're starting to push the limits. Economics and urbanization, where people are migrating to cities globally. In the United States, 80% of the people live in cities, and in the last 10 years in China, it went from about 26% in urban areas, mostly rural living, to now over 53% in China living in cities. So urbanization, economics, and population are critical. And this is impacting all by the environment as well, as obviously we've heard about global warming, changing global patterns of rainfall which influence water, food, and energy. And this is much more complicated than I'm tending to show you. Obviously, we could put all kinds of arrows where the feedback system would be going, because obviously these are influencing the population as well, the population influencing this, and all of them influence the economics, and urbanization influences even the environment, as we heard. The whole of Maslow's pyramid is dependent upon these systems working, and the whole of Maslow's pyramid is now also influencing the environment. So when we consider this system, we can think about the equations that are driving this interconnection and all of the influencing factors, and our mind boggles. Because the mind that we've evolved with is a mind that's meant to deal with, those four things. We're not extremely well adapted to deal with this complexity. Some years ago, I got a grant from the two founders of Google, Larry and Sergey, to do a project I called Sustainable Energy for Spaceship Earth. And when I was doing that sort of investigation of what we know about energy and what we know about the Earth, I realized the gravity of our situation. And I developed a project I called Omega. And Omega sits right here at the fulcrum between energy, food, and water. Because in trying to figure out how we're going to get energy, I realized that this is completely inseparable from food and water. And I came up with a plan, and I want to share that with you right now. The project is called Omega. It's for coastal cities to transform solar energy into sustainable biofuels, electricity, and heat, to expand food production and access to clean water, to eliminate pollution and enhance the coastal environment. Ultimately, it's a project to develop sustainable green economies. Let me tell you how it works. Omega uses protected bays like San Francisco Bay, vast areas which will get even bigger with sea level rise. And most importantly, they already have wastewater treatment plants that currently dump wastewater into the bays. But for Omega, this wastewater is a resource, redirected into floating clear plastic tubes to grow microalgae, the fastest growing plants on the planet and the best producers of oil. The algae grow using nutrients in wastewater, and they use concentrated CO2 from a source like flue gas, which means Omega treats wastewater and captures and controls a major greenhouse gas. The Omega infrastructure is used for solar electricity and concentrated solar thermal. And in some locations, wave-powered generators and wind turbines will also provide power. In addition to energy, the Omega offshore platform supports aquaculture and produces high-quality food without using land and without using water. In fact, saving water is a big deal. It's estimated that by the year 2030, half of all the people in the world will face water shortages. And the current map of water scarcity shows in red that there are already many places in desperate need of clean water. Adapting methods developed for the space station for recycling water, Omega transforms wastewater into clean water using 1/3 the energy required to make clean water from seawater. Think about it. The integrated Omega components are modular, and they can be scaled up without using land. For example, the wastewater from one of the treatment plants in San Francisco will support a 1,280-acre Omega system and produce between 2 and 6 million gallons of biofuels each year. And what will be the environmental impact of the full-scale Omega system? It will be like a huge kelp bed or floating reef that will provide a place for organisms to grow and forage, a refuge and nursery for fish and birds. So it is likely to increase local biodiversity and even enhance commercial fisheries. Omega improves the environment by treating wastewater and capturing CO2. It increases the availability of clean drinking water by recycling wastewater. It supplies food without competing with agriculture. And it provides solar energy as electricity, heat, and biofuels. All things that help move us toward a green economy and a sustainable society. Omega, it's more than a dream. From 2009 until last year, Omega feasibility studies were funded by NASA and the California Energy Commission. And the Omega research team did a lot. We engineered floating plastic bioreactors to grow algae that cleaned wastewater and made biofuels. We built remote control systems and developed harvesting methods. We studied the strength and durability of critical materials, the fluid dynamics of different designs, the effects of biofouling and of cleaning, the impact of toxins from wastewater, and the role of pests that eat algae on the system's productivity. Basically, we monitored, measured, and manipulated everything we could think of for laboratory and tank experiments. And we did some experiments offshore to explore the impact of Omega on the marine environment and the impact of the marine environment on Omega. We also did techno-economic analyses to determine the returns on investments for products and services from Omega. I summarized this work in my TED Global talk. And you can find links to our publications on our Facebook page. This Omega system is the answer to sustainability for coastal cities. So the Omega idea was tested, at least on tanks in laboratory, and we were hoping to put something into San Francisco Bay, and we were confronted by a permitting process that will take at least 5 years and probably more like 10 years and a lot of money. But the concept of Omega is really this idea of putting a multi-component system together and to do it offshore, with the notion that sea level rise will actually be a boon to future generations where they're trying to build floating technology. It will be productive for the environment because we'll no longer be polluting with wastewater. It will produce water, and we can talk about this offline about how the system works in a way that's better than a typical desalination system. It's easier to clean wastewater than it is to get salts out of seawater. Produces food in aquaculture, and in fact, the aquaculture is the economic driver of the system because it's an established market. And it produces energy in the form of water-cooled solar thermal, water-cooled solar PV, and photosynthesis, which is solar biological system. Let me just end with a few brief slides because you guys have been very patient and you're getting into the break time now. I just want to briefly say that when we looked at building a system that was just biofuels and wastewater, and we did what's called a techno-economic analysis of this, we found to our chagrin that the energetics of this don't work. Growing just algal biofuels is neither energetically efficient, i.e. you use more energy than you produce from the biofuels, and it's not economically viable. So we've had the incredible advantage over the last 150 years, almost 200 years, of exploiting coal and oil, which is basically algal biomass that's been treated in the deep earth for a few millions of years. And we've been exploiting that and burning through it pretty fast. We cannot just do now a simple system that is only algae. We have to be more clever than this. We have to build systems that are integrated with solar energy to help meet the energy needs, and most importantly, that include in the subsurface of this system, taking advantage of the location in the ocean, food production in the oceans in ways that we're not yet doing it globally. So the Omega system has the potential to improve the environment, and it's potentially scalable in protected bays. We're not talking about exposed in the open ocean. We're not up to that yet. We have to crawl before we can run against a big ocean environment. But there are lots and lots of places that are naturally protected, and we know how to protect things artificially. It's not competing with our typical agricultural practices on land, and in fact, it will augment what we're doing on land. We can use, as I mentioned, wastewater as a source of drinking water. Why should we use water once and then throw it away in the ocean somewhere or get rid of it? We can reuse it. And finally, we're hoping that it will make a sustainable substitute for fossil fuels that's affordable by being integrated. It's the concept of a department store, right? You have a store and you sell one thing, you have to find a limited number of people. If you build a department store, the possible economic returns, the better revenues because you sell a diversity of things. That's the Omega concept too. The basic idea is that we're talking about an ecosystem where the waste of one part of the system are resources for another part of the system. Nature works this way. We know this stuff. This isn't new. But the notion that we're going to build the system that's an integrated system is not really done very much right now. So let me just close by telling you, I went around trying to figure out how to convince people to do this as an open source. That is, wow, I have this great idea. Well, why don't you build this thing? And it didn't work. So we stormed a company now called the Omega Global Initiative as a nonprofit, because I don't want to deal with people who are only focused on money. And the nonprofit, the Omega Global Initiative, is basically trying to answer the questions, where can we build this thing? Who's going to be willing to build it with our help? How will it be implemented? How long will it take? And what are we actually going to do for each location? Because around the world, it may have different focuses. In the Middle East, it may be more about water recycling and processing and less about biofuels. In Australia, it may be mostly about biofuels, depending on where we are. We've built a roadmap, a very detailed roadmap, and I'll just tell you the overview. The concept in a timeline is we start out evaluating the site, we socialize the concept, we implement a version of this, usually starting out on a demonstration scale, and then we operate the demonstration project for a while to prove that it can work and improve and evolve it, and then we finally move it to commercialization. So what this looks like is that we make our discoveries of sites and we analyze those sites very carefully. We model the sites. So to the audience here, it's important to realize we build a virtual system. We lower the concept of risk because we make people see what it looks like. We hold workshops and we find out if people are interested, and we build a local team to implement it. We don't bring people in from far away. The local people know how to build this, and we build a demonstration that, as I mentioned, will then be appraised, will be shaken down for some period of time, and then commercialized. We've already looked in a lot of places in the world. In September, I was talking to people in Adelaide, and I thought that they would build a system there, but it looks like they've changed their minds. The basic concept, though, is that there are lots of places in the world that can build it. The question is, who's going to be first? Because the issue, the most important issue, is finding one first person. Why is that? Because we need to try to come to terms with building a more resilient system that will be sustainable. We need to face the problems that we have, and unfortunately, or fortunately, what we have evolved to do that with are the brains that we have. Over 93.7% of our evolution that were adapted to dealing with these types of issues having to do with threats, having to do with immediate problems of finding food, and of course finding mates. But most importantly, we have to use our abilities to be curious and build programs that are going to model this type of system in a way that's somewhat different, because it won't be individuals now, it'll be teams, and it'll be teams working together to realize this type of structure. So let me end here. If anybody's interested in OGI or wants to know more details about the technology, I'll be happy to talk to you about it. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, 20 at a time.